According to Oryx, Russia has now lost more than 1,200 tanks, so to keep up their strength, they're obviously going to need to replace them. They do have a huge number of tanks in storage, but it's not infinite. A lot of sources online will state 10,000 or more. I found about 6,000, which I made a video on, but it's now been 7 months of fighting. So I wanted to see how many tanks those storage sites have left today and find out if they're running out. So I bought a bunch of recent satellite imagery to check. It wasn't cheap, and I had no clue what I'd find, but was excited to figure out the results. And since it wasn't cheap, I couldn't have done it without today's sponsor, NordVPN. You've heard it before, a VPN is important, but instead of just preaching, I figured I'd show you how I use it. One huge benefit is being able to get around geographical restrictions. Ever since the war in Ukraine, Russia blocked access to their Ministry of Defense website based on what country you're in, which was a problem for me because I used it all the time to get the most detailed and up-to-date information on their military. But then I found I could use NordVPN and connect through Cyprus and get access. Now, odds are, personally, you probably don't care to visit that site, but this blocking by location happens all over, even on YouTube. Often though, the problem is with VPNs is they're slow, but this is where NordVPN also stands out from the rest. There are more than 5,500 servers in 59 different countries, means there's likely servers near you to maximize your speed. That's just a small bit of their dozens of other features they have. So go over and check them out. Use my link, nordvpn.com/covert, get a 2-year plan, and you'll get 4 months for free. All for about the price of a cup of coffee. You can protect yourself online for a month. And they have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you're not happy, you can get a full refund. Again, go over to nordvpn.com/covert and check them out. The exact number of tanks Russia has in service, not counting those in storage, before the war isn't known for sure, but it was somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000. Military Balance 2021 states 2,840, and that's between those, so let's just use that. Those wouldn't all be operational and ready for battle though. Electrical components fail, as well as hydraulics, gears, tracks, cracks in the chassis, etc. And all that needs to be repaired or replaced. According to the GAO, during the Gulf War, the Abrams tank's operational readiness rate was over 90%. The newer M1A1 had a higher rate of roughly 95%, while the older M1 was about 91%. And that makes sense in general. The older the tank, the more problems it'll have, just like any civilian vehicle. Both versions of the Abrams, though, were pretty new at the time. The base M1 on average was 9 years old, and the M1 Abram on average just 3 years old. So, for the purposes of this video, if we want to get an idea on Russia's tanks, we can look at the age. Their tanks are older on average. If we take the average age of each tank and then the number of each of those they have, the average tank Russia has is nearly 14 years old. So if that trend continues, we could expect Russia's readiness rate to be around 88%. But also there's things like usage and maintenance which will impact that readiness rate, and based on what we've seen in Ukraine, that number might be as low as 80 or 85%, maybe even lower. But all that to say, Russia likely has around 2,300 operational tanks ready and able to fight. So then, going back according to Oryx, Russia has lost about 1,200 tanks, which would leave them around 1,100 left. If correct, that means they lost more than half their entire tank force. And this is where Russia's tanks in storage come in. In a previous video, I came up with about 6,000 tanks in storage, roughly half of which appearing reasonably salvageable. But that was based on free imagery from Google Earth, which would vary anywhere from a few months old to several years old. Things could have and likely did change in the interval. So I decided to purchase a bunch of recent satellite imagery of the sites to get a better figure. I also then bought images of each site before the war to see the changes. With so many tanks lost, how many are they pulling out of storage, and how many do they have left? Really quickly to explain, Russia stores their tanks and other vehicles in what are called BHI RVTs and TSTRBs. They have about 24 of these sites, half of which currently containing tanks. To keep things simple though, and less expensive for me, I just looked at the 8 largest. The other ones are real small, with only a few dozen tanks each. Also, most images were taken a year apart. The first in mid-2021 as a reference for before the war, then the new one within the last 30 days. Also, counting these things is a nightmare. Like this here. After looking at it for way too long, I can tell only the red here are actually tanks. So the number will have some margin of error, but it's as close as I can get. I'm also only counting tanks that look salvageable, so not these here. So let's take a look and see how they've changed. The first is a 22nd. Last year it had about 800 good tanks. Now you can see it's thinned out a bit. Some could be parked inside those shelters, but it's down to around 700 now. The next is the 103rd. The first image here is from 2 years ago. So over the past 2 years, a lot of APCs and other vehicles have disappeared. Also, most of the old inoperable tanks have been removed. But the number of tanks is similar, from about 400 to 380 as of late August. Then the 111th. From here, there's almost no change whatsoever, but the image here is older, from 3 months ago. There's about 350 in each. I did buy an image from September 21st, but unfortunately I have not got it back in time for this video. I did get a much lower resolution from last week, and it seems like there may be 100 or so less, but with the lower resolution it's just way too hard to tell. The 227th didn't see a lot of changes either. In late August 2021, it had over 1,000 good tanks, now under 900, so about 150 less. However, this here is also home to the 5th Guards Tank Brigade, so a lot of these tanks here we see are not being stored, but they're active in units. Next is the 349th. This site is also massive. Last summer there were about 700, and now somewhere around 600, 100 less than before. Following that is the 1295th. Most of the tanks here are well beyond repair, but it had about 215, now down to 180. It's hard to tell for sure though, because those garages could easily be holding 35 more tanks. Now we have the 1311th, which is also a bit hard with the garages, but last year around 350, now in early September 250. And then finally the 2544th. This one was real hard as they moved around a lot of vehicles, likely as they're pulling them to make repairs and get them ready to send to Ukraine, but now it has around 500 compared to last October's 700, so 200 less. So for these 8 sites, they have about 700 to 800 tanks less than a year ago, and that's not that far off from the 1,200 tanks they've lost. It would take some time to repair and get these stored tanks ready for combat, so you would expect it to kind of lag behind the number of losses. One site I did leave out though was the 7024th. This one is right on the border with Ukraine and appears to be being used as a hub for tanks being sent into Ukraine. Tanks and other vehicles are always coming and going, likely from those other storage locations, so trying to count them is pointless. But since I paid for it, here it is. You can see hundreds of trucks, tanks, and other fighting vehicles spread out, some of them being stored for later, others being moved around, being repaired, etc. Then, one final location I thought would be interesting to show is the 94th Arsenal in Omsk. It doesn't contain any tanks, it's mostly artillery, but again we can see how it's changed over the last year. Again, you can see a lot of hardware and vehicles have been removed over the past year. Like these large vehicles here are their massive 2 S7s, now roughly half of them remain. So, in the end, they are drawing down on their tank reserves. Based on the rate of losses and total tanks remaining and usable in storage, Russia can keep up their strength and fully equip their formations for about a year and a half. In less than 3 years, they'll be completely out of tanks. Obviously though, that pass rate can and will change over time. But it takes a lot more time to train new tank crews. In the US Army, it's 22 weeks, or about 5 months. Russia seems to be similar. And a tank commander can take much longer to train. Then also on top of that, there's training the mechanics to keep the tanks running, which is another long process. So in terms of Russia's mobilization, it will take some time. Some of those mobilized may have had past training, and then the courses can be shortened, but then that starts to decrease the quality of the crews, and also those drafted will not be as highly motivated as they're being forced to be there. Also, who will train all these people is not known. A large percentage of Russia's officers are already in Ukraine fighting, so it seems more likely Russia will run out of competent tank crews before tanks themselves. Then also real quick, after recounting these sites, I found that I had made a mistake in my previous video on Russian tank numbers. I had misidentified some, causing me to be off at this base here by about 450. The funny thing is though, some outlets that posted about tank numbers shortly after my video came out also included that error, so you could tell they didn't actually look into it or do any research for themselves, just copied me without giving credit. So if they're watching, this number here should have been 700 and now it's 500. Anyway, that's it. Let me know if you enjoyed the satellite imagery. It's not cheap, so I want to make sure it's worth it. And if you really liked it, check out my Patreon or even take another look at the sponsor again, as they're the ones that make all this possible. Thanks.